Accutron Watches present. From New York City, this is the Accutron Show, a time travel through American culture with your hosts, Bill McCuddy, Scott Alexander, and David Graver. Visit AccutronWatch.com and discover the brand that has made American history with an all-new proprietary next-generation electrostatic energy movement. Accutron. It's not a timepiece, it's a conversation piece.
Many of us think there's something special about mechanical watches, which might be different from quartz watches or purely digital watches. There's something about heartbeats. There's something about the fact that those things are alive.
The person you heard at the top of the show is today's guest. He is David Rooney, writer and curator and author of the critically acclaimed book, About Time, A History of Civilization in 12 Clocks. He's here for a special episode of our podcast that is dedicated to history. But first up, me, Bill McCuddy, along with culture writer Scott Alexander and editor David Graver. Why I still have to read that off a page, I have no idea. I know them. All that and more on this very special episode of the Accutron Show. Stay tuned.
This podcast is presented by Accutron Watches. Visit our website, accutronwatch.com, and discover our iconic Space View 2020 collection, recreating the stunning visual impact of the original open dial design combined with an all-new electrostatic energy movement. Time just changed again. The Accutron Space View 2020.
Jim Croce put it in a bottle. Morris Day sang in front of it. There's a magazine called Time that Las Vegas actually takes odds on as to who will be the person or persons of the year. And today, the Accutron Show, in honor of history, in this special edition, is talking about time. We're giving you the time of day.
It's time for time.
It is time for time. Man, and this guy, David Rooney, does an incredible deep dive into the 12, he believes, most significant civilization-changing clocks or timepieces. We told time in a lot of different ways.
I don't want to spoil anything, but there's like about 100 clocks in this book. Like he says 12 on the cover, but it covers a lot more than that. It's a remarkable book. I've been blown away reading it.
So you've been spending your time reading about time.
My time is spent with time. And
Where's the world's biggest clock?
I believe the world's biggest clock is in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, it's
I learned that from the book About Time.
Yeah, well,
it is in Mecca, and it's like 140 feet across or something. It's also the world's highest clock.
You know, they had to be high because they had to be high because they wrote this book. No, they had to be high.
But this is not the 420 podcast. Right. It's not that time.
Do you often think about your relationship to time? I think about it all the time, from looking at my phone to looking at my watch to trying to understand why my Google Calendar owns my life. I think about time as a concept.
Really? Because you were late today.
I was the first one. I'm always the first one.
It's this funny. It's this funny contradiction about time because you say Google Calendar owns your life. Me too. I do feel enslaved to time, but at the same time, I use timers and keeping track of time for my work and everything else so that I can relax, so that I can have the time on the weekends.
You think that's true, though? I mean, that sounds great what you're saying, but I think we end up being slaves to the time and worried about where we're supposed to be and who we're going to meet and whether they're going to be on time. And it's really
I'd say on balance, I
exhausting.
worry about time more than I forget about time. That's
it's a great question about whether time, as we know it, has helped us progress or has actually set us back a little. When it comes to the history of time, we actually kind of have the Yoda of timekeeping. He is a curator. He has helped bury clocks, invent them, and he's going to tell us all about time. David Rooney joins us in this very special history lesson. He's doing the teaching, we're doing the listening on the Accutron Show. Don't go away.
This podcast is presented by Accutron Watches. Visit our website, accutronwatch.com, and discover our Accutron DNA collection. Reimagined for a new generation, the Accutron DNA combines breakthrough technology, precise engineering, and modern aesthetics to achieve a new level of technical excellence. The Accutron DNA, the new face of time for those who blaze new trails.
David Rooney has written a fascinating book called About Time, A History of Civilization in 12 Clocks. And he joins us from Greenwich, the home of GMT time. David, welcome to the Accutron Show, and thank you for being our guest today.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Well, I guess my first question is, the way you look at time in this book is not just through 12 clocks. It's almost like a movie or a novel. It's got everything. It's got suspense. It's got romance. It's got things blowing up, violence. How do you explain time to people when they say, oh, come on, it's just a clock?
I mean, this was what was wonderful for me to be doing the research for writing this book, which was, I've been working in museums with horological collections for like 25 years. I've been kind of interested in the story of clocks and watches for a lot longer. But what I was trying to do with this book, which was very different, was not to kind of write a story about how clocks and watches work. I mean, there's plenty of amazing books that do that already, but I was interested in what they mean. So like why people have made them, why, in many cases, why people have spent a lot of money and effort making these horological devices, and not, around, across civilizations through history. This isn't a recent story, and it's not a Western story only. And it was a way for me to what I wanted to do was to zoom right out of the picture and not to focus on any particular technology. Like you might think of what we might consider as clocks or watches. I wanted to think of any device that had been made by humans with the purpose of tracking the passage of time. Right. So that might be a sundial, it might be a sandglass, a time-finding telescope, whatever. And that really helped me look much more broadly, geographically and historically, to sort of really understand what it is that we've been doing for thousands of years.
You mentioned devices that mark the passage of time. There's not a lot of calendars in this book, but there's a lot of clocks. What was the distinction there?
I mean, calendars, if you take my kind of broad definition of what a clock is, then calendars could be included.
Okay.
Of course they could.
So something like Stonehenge or...
I mean, Stonehenge is an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, that's so far back in history that really understanding what the purpose of it was.
Yeah, help us solve that one, David. If we can crack that code, we can break a little news here on the podcast. It's a calendar,
among other things. It's a calendar, right?
But as you said, calendars are devices for tracking the passage of time just as much as clocks are. I mean, and there are elements of calendars in the book when we consider some of the astronomical and astrological clocks, the huge clocks like the ones in Strasbourg or Prague.
Or the Islamic clocks, yeah.
And the Islamic clocks as well, which considering these longer time cycles and the patterns of the movements of the heavenly bodies. So it kind of does come into the story, but I think certainly as we come up to the more recent past, there's something about devices that move, which act as kind of replicas of the moving planets and heavenly bodies.
And the human body, because you say the beat of a clock is almost like the beat of or the tick of a clock is almost like the beat of a heart.
Well, maybe I'm being too romantic there, but I'm sure that there is something in that. We talk, we're interested in watches, right? And so there's something, many of us think there's something special about mechanical watches, which might be different from quartz watches or purely digital watches. There's something about heartbeats. There's something about the fact that those things are alive. And that the life was breathed into them by the craftspeople who made them. That I think as long as we've had mechanical watches and clocks, I think we've tapped into that. And maybe I'm being fanciful there. But
well, you have it right there in the temperance section. You talk about how they really related the mechanism of the human body, where they went from hourglass to clock to symbolize death. Right. That these things are the lifespan,
and that a body should be like a well-ordered clock. That it should be looked after. That it should be cared for and maintained. And if you do that, then it will run at the right speed, not too fast, not too slow, and it'll keep going. Yeah.
And that was fascinating to me, that the roots of those words, temperance, I had never thought of that before. I was like, temperance, that has tempus in it, basically. Are those a common root?
He's never thought of temperance before.
Well, that's true.
None of us have.
But is that a common root?
I mean, it was a hard virtue to sell even then. But the roots are very similar, temperantia and tempus. and right back to the Roman period and further back, people were thinking about those two ideas together, the passage of time and like a temperate life as being going at the right speed, not too fast, not too slow.
I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about resistance, because time as a concept functions so long as we all agree that it functions for all of us. There must have been throughout all of these clocks, throughout our understanding of time, resistance to it.
Absolutely. A really significant theme that kind of cut through all of the stories that I was writing about. I mean, a lot of the story is about power. It's about the exertion of power. It's about power structures. It's about order and control. So, and a lot of it, therefore, has to be about kind of a top-down idea of order, that we're being kept in order by rulers or by military leaders or by the leaders of our faith and so on. But it would be fatalistic, wouldn't it, for us to submit to that always? And so there's that sense of resistance that comes through history, where people have fought back against the order that people are seeking to impose on us, the power that they're exerting over us. And sometimes people have fought back against clocks which are proxies for that. And sometimes they've fought back with clocks. I mean, there's some incredible examples in history that I talk about, from suffragettes in Scotland to anarchists to people in India fighting against the British Raj in the 19th century, people in the American South fighting against enslavement, people in the English North fighting against mill and factory owners. And how in all of those circumstances, clocks and time have been used in a kind of a top-down power structure, but people fight back.
Yeah, they show up on one morning at a factory or in a country, and suddenly in the town square, there's a giant clock. And you point out many times they pull a gun out and start shooting at it and destroying it. They're just wigged out by this thing that's like watching over them.
The example that I gave of India under British rule in the late 19th and early 20th century, astonishing story about how time was used to, how kind of times and time scales were used to show who your allegiances were with. There was a period of time in India where there were 3 times that you could choose to keep. Let's say you were in Mumbai as it is today. You might have been a factory worker in Mumbai, and there'd be Bombay time, the time according to where you are. But then the British Raj sought to impose a standard time, which was actually Madras time, because there was a British-controlled observatory in Madras. And then that was then followed by what was called Indian Standard Time, which is 5.5 hours different from Greenwich, which is the standard time now in India. And so there's a tale where one morning the factory owners in a Bombay textile factory changed to Indian Standard Time without telling the workers. And sure, when they arrived at work the next morning, thousands of people on the morning shift, they started to pelt the clock tower with stones because it stood in for this control.
And depending on whose watch they were looking at, they were either late, early, or they were supposed to come the next day. This is all fascinating. One of the many fascinating stories, time was kept in a bowl. The other thing that I found fascinating was when you go to the North Pole, you can walk around in a circle and be in all the world's time zones in one small lap up there. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the way time has been gerrymandered almost in these different time zones. You mentioned India, 5.5 hours different in one place. I know some time zones do use the half hour.
Newfoundland.
This is mind-boggling to me.
Is on the half hour.
It doesn't make any sense. But you make sense of it all, and we are going to have time for you right after this. We'll take a short break and be right back with David.
This podcast is presented by Accutron Watches. Visit our website, accutronwatch.com, and discover our legacy collection, reviving some of the most memorable Accutron watches from the 60s and 70s. The legacy collection combines timeless design with the technical excellence of Swiss watchmaking, each limited to 600 individually numbered pieces. The Accutron Legacy Collection, inspired by the past, built for the future.
Welcome back. We're talking to David Rooney about his new book, About Time, A History of Civilization in 12 Clocks. And when we went away, we were talking about the times and how it's worked for and against us. And also, I want to ask you about time zones. But David wants to take the other side of this and say, hey, come on, clocks have done some good things, haven't they?
What have we gained? In opposition to the resistance, what have we gained by keeping a clock on our wrist moving forward?
There's always been tensions throughout this story, so it's never been a story about one side or the other. It's always complex. When you think now in the 21st century about what clocks in the broadest sense have enabled in the modern world, it's utterly astonishing. I mean, it's fair to say that the modern world only functions because of clocks. You can think of any aspect of modernity, what makes life modern, and clocks underpin it, in a really strong way, whether that's being able to move, to be able to travel long distances around the world, being able to communicate anywhere with anyone around the world, right? Infrastructure, electric power, clean water, sewage being taken away. Logistics, being able to buy products, food, goods from anywhere in the world, and for them to be able to arrive here at a reasonable cost. All of these things which go to make the modern world work because of clocks. I mean, there's a flip side to that, of course, which is what if those clocks stopped working or got tampered with? And that's another story that I find very interesting.
Back to the wristwatch.
This is the point, what if you believe that modern life is a good thing, if you believe in progress, then in a very real way, all the stories that I've been putting together in this book have led to the conclusion that we are where we are because of clocks. And many other things, of course, but there's something really significant about clocks for thousands of years.
Is there a point where the sort of accuracy, I understand the accuracy is important, and you talk about that in the finance section and in the atomic clock section, but in the atomic clock section in particular, I was fascinated to learn about the unbelievable precision that we would lose half a second from the dawn of the universe. Why do we need clocks that are that accurate?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, in many ways, we don't. In many aspects of our life, imprecision is what we strive for, and so we all have multiple times in our lives, I think, and many of those are, as I say, imprecise. We want them to be because life's imprecise and complex. So there's a really good question: what clocks do we want in the world? And watches, and make sure that we make those. I've been involved for a while now with a group of people based in San Francisco, the Long Now Foundation, who are thinking about how clocks can make us think longer into the future, to kind of extend our temporal horizon much further into the future, so that we might make better decisions now. So they've made a clock which can run for 10,000 years. If maintained and if cared for, a mechanical clock. I used to caretake the prototype, which is at the London Science Museum. So in some ways, people are making clocks which aren't super accurate. They aren't precise. Danny Hillis, who was the designer of the Long Now clock, he'd worked on supercomputer design in the 1980s, some of the fastest computers ever made. And he said that he designed the Long Now clock, which is the slowest computer that's ever been made, to atone for his sins in speeding the world up in the 1980s. But these super accurate clocks that have been made that are in GPS satellites and data centers and high frequency trading and all of that, which are kind of nanosecond accuracy and precision, billionths of a second. Of course, it's not about knowing the time of day that precisely. It's what they enable in other technologies. They enable sat-nav to find your position to a smaller and finer grain. They enable scientific research to be stronger or better. So I think there's a kind of a whole constellation of clocks at this end of the scale are these super accurate ones, but they're not the only clocks that we're making, and it's great to celebrate them all.
I was fascinated. I teased it at the top about the different time zones, and even if we had a clock that everybody was on that was super accurate and they were all synchronized to one another, you got India or China or other places where they're. How can they do a half hour? How can we be 5.5 hours different from anything? China is on one time zone, isn't that correct?
That's right. And it's 5 hours worth of time wide. Yeah.
So how do they sync anything up? How do we?
Well, they know probably more easily than we do. Why isn't there just one time for the whole world?
Well, because then it would be lunch for some people and breakfast for, what I mean?
Who cares? Then you know
function.
you know that noon for you or 6 for you or.
Okay, but noon, but then 5:30.
Let's hear what David thinks about this.
Where do you weigh in on this? We're confused.
You are replaying the sorts of discussions that were being had in 1884 in Washington, D.C., in a conference room at the International Meridian Conference that first set up the idea of standardized time zones for the world, for a single origin time, a prime meridian for the world, one line to measure all time and space from, and the idea of zones around the world that all reference back to that one line. And all of these arguments about should there be a universal time, I mean, that had been floated since the 1860s and 70s. Sometimes it was called cosmic time, often universal time. The idea that, come on, let's flip our understanding of what time means. And as you say, instead of thinking 7 a.m. is breakfast time, then instead you learn what breakfast time means where you are. It's a different number. That's all it is. And the politics of all of that is what really, really interests me. I mean, it was a political conference, not a scientific one. It was diplomats and politicians. And the arguments is like, whose time is the universal time? Where is that meridian? And it was chosen to be Greenwich. It was chosen to be like a 15-minute walk from where I'm sitting right now in Greenwich. Now, you can imagine at the height of the strength of the British Empire that a decision that Britain's time is going to be the time for the world, that everyone in the world is going to march to the beat of a clock just a few hundred yards over there. That looks like imperialism to some people. I mean, for instance, the French nation absolutely detested the decision and refused to accept it. Kept Paris Mean Time for years afterwards, only moved to Greenwich Mean Time in the early 20th century, but they wouldn't call it Greenwich Mean Time. They called it Paris Mean Time, retarded by 9 minutes and 21 seconds. And that was the legal definition of time in France until the 1970s.
Well, they thought Greenwich time was mean, so they didn't feel like
Greenwich time is super
mean. They were pissed. Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, is it a 15-minute walk from you, plus or minus 2 to 3 seconds, or is that
Hey, I'm on the nanosecond scale, man.
Do you go down there and sort of meditate on the line or anything? Do you have any kind of ritual around being on the line?
I mean, I'm going to say, yeah. I mean, I used to work there. I used to work at the Royal Observatory. I was the curator of timekeeping, so I was kind of responsible for it's a national museum, so I was like sharing the memory of this horological history, which the world has increasingly moved away from and become kind of more universal. And it is an amazing place to go and commune at, really. It's in the middle of a beautiful park. But the point you made about time zones and how the idea in 1884 was that there'd be 24 neat 1 hour time zones around the world, and they'd have neat straight lines dividing them. But of course, geography gets in the way because those neat lines don't match up with country boundaries. So as soon as geography and geopolitics kicked in, it was never going to be a project that worked. And so there are numerous fractional time zones around the world. There's India, which is a half-hour zone. There's Nepal, which is a 3/4-hour zone. You've said that China is 5 hours wide, but it's only a single zone, and that's Beijing time, which is quite far in the east. So if you're in the west of China, you're getting up at really unusual hours of the day. Think about Australia. Australia has a fractional zone, but it's also not just divided longitudinally. It also has different daylight saving time zones. So like like south of the line, there'll be daylight saving time, and north there won't be. So there's like 5 time zones in Australia.
David, will you settle for once and for all that daylight savings time is stupid?
And obviously politicized, as you mentioned earlier.
Daylight saving time. I mean, the history of that is, the idea goes back originally to a British house builder who had a moral urge to get people out of bed early in the mornings, because he saw that people were wasting the daylight that God had given us, and they were sleeping through the first hour of light. And his way of solving this problem is to change the hands on the clocks and watches of 1/4 of the population of Earth twice a year, which we still do. We still change the hands on every clock and watch twice a year, because some guy in Kent in 1905 decided that it would be good for us.
I'm curious. You've written this magnificent book about significant historical clocks. Do you have meaningful timepieces yourself? Do you have sentimental value affixed to something you'd like to share with us?
That's a really good question. I mean, because I've spent my career in museums, I've been working with some of the most remarkable collections of clocks and watches anywhere. So I've never been a collector myself, because I could never compete with the collections that I've been charged with looking after. So I've only got a few like odds and ends around. But there's one clock which I keep thinking back to. It's actually in the next room. So my interest in and my connection with horology goes back to early childhood, because when I was 8 years old, my parents decided to change career and set up a clockmaking and clock restoration business.
As you do.
As you do. So it was a midlife career change. So they set up this business in the family home in northeast England, and for the next, until I left home 10 years later to go to university, like I was a small part of the business. I'd go with them as they would be picking up clocks or putting them back and setting them up. And there were a couple of things that really kind of hit me and have stayed with me through my life. The first was that every clock or watch or timekeeper is important to somebody. Now, there are some, of course, which the world finds important, like the John Harrison marine timekeepers that changed the world of navigation and set the course of empires. But what about those cheap clocks that you might have bought in the 1930s or 1940s? They're mass-produced clocks, which are of no historical significance. But what my parents taught me was they're significant to the people who own them. They've all got a story, and it's a story that's powerful for those people. And the second thing is that really hit home. The clock that's in the other room, it's a 1940s Metamec, mass-produced, battery-powered, balance wheel, kind of pre-quartz electric. Nice little thing. You get them for $5 on eBay. And my father, when I was 8, he went to college to study clockmaking to set up the business. As part of it, he picked this Metamec clock out of a dumpster. Someone had just chucked it out because it had no value, and he rescued it and he restored it for me, for a present for his son. You know, he restored the movement. He took the movement apart, even though it's cheap. You know, he repaired it. He lubricated it. He repaired the wooden case, he repaired the glass, and gave it to me. And I was 8 years old, and I was given a clock that my father had brought back to life. And I've still got it. It's been with me ever since. I mean, that was 40 years ago. And it still ticks. I've had it repaired once. And that just reminds me, whenever I'm thinking, is this story big enough? It just reminds me that every story is big enough.
I mean,
$5 on eBay and priceless to you.
yeah, one of the biggest stories, in human history, the story of time. The one thing that kept coming back to me as I was reading the book was that what an agreement time ends up being between people. And it feels like we're in a time where there's so little agreement. Agreement is in such short supply at the moment. Do you think time is the last thing we can all agree on? Can we all still agree on time?
I'd like to give a hopeful answer to that, but I would have to say that everything that I've found by looking at how political time is, that whenever you think that time might be something universal that at least we can all agree on, we find we don't agree. I mean, we just had the conversation about daylight saving time, right? And kind of the passions that arouses are really strong. I know in the States, but also in the UK here, the idea of standardized time, the fact it's all Greenwich time in the UK, the fact, the politics of it is so profound because we care so much about clocks and time that I'm sure that it probably brings more difference and more dissent. But perhaps I'm just being pessimistic here.
There's one great, since you're in Greenwich and we talked about that earlier, there's one great story about a family who actually went around selling time because they were able to take the GMT time from where you are right now and go to London and say to people once a week, this is the actual time. And I guess they were actually synchronizing that watch or clock to whatever subscriber they went to visit. Tell us about that family, because I think that's fascinating.
I mean, this was a story that really rams home how time is a commodity. Time's got value. It's got a monetary value. People are prepared to pay a lot of money for it to this day. It was the year 1836 that John Belleville, who was an astronomer at the Royal Observatory, Greenwich, started carrying a pocket watch, a pocket chronometer made by John Arnold a few years earlier, corrected to a tenth of a second to the time kept by the time-finding telescopes at the observatory in Greenwich, the master timekeeper for Britain, and then carried it around a subscriber round of London once a week. And you'd pay an annual subscription to get a weekly look at the watch and a certificate to say that this watch is accurate to so many tenths of a second from Greenwich time at the observatory. And at the start, in 1836, he had like 200 subscribers across London. And they were across like the merchants, the people out in the docks, right, the commercial centre, businesses, but also eventually the homes of some individuals. He died in the 1850s, and the service was taken on first by his wife, Maria Belleville, and then their daughter, Ruth Belleville, with the same watch, carrying it around many of the same customers until the year 1940. So 104 years after John Belleville first started it, people were still paying. In the age of the wireless time signals and telegraph time signals, the speaking clock, the telephone clock, was just around the corner, and people were still paying for this early 19th century watch to arrive in her handbag. And you know what really interested me about the story was because it wasn't just like an anachronism. People were paying good money because this was valuable. For a start, a tenth of a second accuracy was better than almost any other way you could get the time. It was better than telegraph time, it's better than radio time. But also you trusted it because you'd seen the certificate, you knew the certificate was legitimate, and you'd had Ruth turn up at your shop or your factory every week for decades.
Right.
And you built
That's a
up that
movie.
trust.
I'm sorry. That's a movie.
Right?
The Lady Who Sold Time.
David,
The Lady Who Sold Time.
Now I can take my iPhone out and I can tell you the time, but I still wear a wristwatch every single day. Do you have thoughts on that? Do you think there's something above and beyond with regard to meaning for a watch?
Absolutely, without a doubt. And this is nothing new. This is since the start of watches. You could argue even since the start of clocks. of course, they tell more than the time. Of course, they're expressions of our identities. I mean, even some of the earliest watches, the earliest clocks, did far more than tell you the time. They were multi-purpose devices like a cell phone or a smartwatch are today, that have all kinds of calendrical devices. They might have alarms on there, all kinds of things. And we wear them, we own them, we care about them because they say something about us. I mean, it might just be in the early years an expression of your wealth, certainly an expression of your taste, and an expression of how you were connected with the sorts of people who could make these things when they were really very rare. That you had enough taste and position in society that you could have access to one of these complicated watches. So I see what we've got today. I mean, I'm exactly the same. Of course, I've got a cell phone, but of course, I also wear a watch every day.
What's on your wrist?
Yeah.
Well, strangely enough, as
I
it
think
happens,
we know. Yeah.
it's the Accutron, and one of the reasons, of course, I think that we're all interested in this is because it's connections with the past as well as connections with people. I mean, the connections with the people who make them, who innovate and think of new ways to solve these age-old problems, but also connections to the past. I mean, the original Accutron in the 1960s was a period of astonishing technical development. And so watches aren't timekeepers. I mean, that's almost like the least that they do.
You're wearing an Accutron on your wrist right now, and when the Accutron originated in the 60s, it was a period of tremendous technological advancement. Can you talk a little bit about the significant achievements of the 60s?
I mean, the 1960s was just astonishing. When you right, in two ways, I think. First, in terms of what happened during that decade, but also what had happened leading up to that decade. That was kind of ideas that were realized then, but it had a long gestation. So if you take like bookends for the 1960s, in 1960, let's say, for example, the Accutron, which came out very much a product of kind of the techno-scientific developments from the Second World War onwards, particularly ideas like the transistor. I mean, the introduction of the transistor in the late 40s really revolutionized. I mean, of course, it revolutionized the world when you think about computing, consumer electronics, but of course the watch. And what Hetzel was doing, making the Accutron, was kind of riding on that enthusiasm. Interestingly, I think the tuning fork that he decided to go for as the time base had a long and a noble history as a frequency standard in science, in kind of physiology research, in radio research and engineering. And he put the two together to make something which, we know that the quartz watch changed things 10 years later, but for those 10 years, this was an astonishing product of scientific advancement.
It was the Betamax, and then VHS came along. You can argue which was better, obviously, and the VHS displaced Beta, but the Beta was a superior product at the time. So,
and there are always so many reasons why one particular technology kind of sticks, right, and others don't, and it's not always which is technically the best. Absolutely. Take a look at 1969, the first flight of the first supersonic airliners, Concorde and Concordski, the first flight of the Boeing 747, the jumbo jet, the democratized mass flight, the first humans on the moon, right? So, I mean, those are stories which actually the Accutron played an interesting role in. But so that's my first point. Like, that's incredible. Getting humans on the moon, getting kind of mass flight, getting supersonic flight for commercial flight was astonishing. But all of those things were also riding on like 50 years before. I mean, if you think about the 1969, it was only 50 years since the first aircraft flew across the Atlantic. Only 50 years. And we had supersonic airliners. We had the 747, which has only just gone out of use. We had humans on the moon just 50 years after the first flight across the Atlantic. And so the 60s was this flourishing of these ideas that have been building and building. Of course, the Second World War had this disruptive effect, in many ways a catalyzing effect on some of those technologies after the war. But certainly for historians of technology and science, it's a decade that's worth a lot of attention.
I like that you wear the Accutron and know a lot about it.
Taking it back a little further in history, I was fascinated to read about the clock in Chioggia in Italy. I think it's pronounced that way, which I think is the oldest still operating clock. Is that correct?
It's, as far as I know, it's the oldest surviving clock in the world.
Okay. What was fascinating to me was that it was sort of the symbol at the time of this order being sort of brought back finally after this tremendous disorder of the plagues and this period of turmoil. And we're going through such a period of turmoil with our own sort of plague and things like this. If you could build a clock somewhere to sort of bring us out of disorder and into order, do you have a dream clock you'd build?
I mean, that clock in Chioggia is incredible. So it's the oldest surviving clock in the world. There's one in Salisbury Cathedral from the same year. There's none known older than that. And that clock, which was a public clock, interestingly, not a church clock, it was on a public building in 1386, still running in Chioggia, built at the end of this hellish period in that part of Italy. There was the Black Death pandemic, but they'd also emerged from a terrible war between rival states that had used Chioggia as kind of a battleground. The hell that they'd gone through was terrible, and there are, of course, some parallels with what we're going through right now. And the idea of that clock, that really expensive clock, being built at a time when they had no money. So the fact they spent money on a clock is really telling. This sense of bringing back order after all of this disorder is absolutely what I think's happening right now, post-COVID, when we're not post-COVID, but when we are. Actually, I think all of the clocks, which, we've talked about how clocks kind of underpin everything in the modern world. What with COVID, we've seen so much disruption of how things were, whether that's, logistics or healthcare or whatever. All of those clocks are going to be bringing back order as quickly as possible, and it's already happening. Now whether it's a good thing that how things used to be is how things will be again is a matter for debate. But we can be sure, without doubt, that clocks are part of whatever emerges after this pandemic.
Well, and speaking of that, and apropos of what Scott was saying about designing the next clock or having the perfect clock that we could all agree on, you have been part of or know of a clock that was buried, an atomic clock that's going to be dug up in several more centuries when maybe your book will be about 13 or 14 clocks instead of 12. Tell us a little bit about that history as kind of a wrap-up for this episode, and who's going to dig it up and who's taking care of it in the meantime? Do we know it's going to be accurate when we pull it up? Give us a little history on the atomic clock.
This was the final clock that I talked about in the book, and yes, it's an atomic clock, but it's not an atomic clock like we know them today. In satellites or broadcast centers or whatever. This was a product of the atomic age, like the Accutron, actually. A product of the 1950s being realized in the mid-1960s onwards. This clock, which was made in Japan by Seiko and Matsushita, is a plutonium clock. So it's a radioactive clock. It's kind of about like 10 inches high. It's a polished steel cylinder with a dial on the top, diameter probably about 6 inches diameter. It's got a single hand, and there's a pellet of plutonium oxide inside, which is steadily radiating helium nuclei into a bellows that can expand. And as those helium nuclei enter that chamber, the bellows are expanding very, very slowly, because this is a clock which will run for 5,000 years. It'll take 5,000 years to get the hand round the dial. Each marking on the dial is the passing of another century. This clock was developed in the 1960s. There was quite a few kind of radioactive clocks being developed. The first in 1959 actually probably not far from where you are in New York City, in Chase Manhattan Bank on Pine Street, got a radioactive clock, which I don't know, perhaps you can pop around and see if it's still there. But it was kind of this clock to show the stability of Chase Manhattan. It's going to be there for centuries to come. And then in the Osaka World Expo for 1970, they decided this would be the symbol of the future. They had this clock made by Seiko and Matsushita, 5,000 years, put it in a time capsule and buried it deep under a park in Osaka in Japan, with strict instructions that it remain there for 5,000 years. And then it gets brought to the surface again if there's a civilization that can do that, that can remember it, and it'll be kind of the biggest unboxing that you will ever see. As this clock is brought out, and as the hand will have been ticking round to the final position, and then the rest of this time capsule, which is kind of life in Japan in 1970. And what an expression of hope for the future. I mean, they had school kids writing passages and poems to the people of the year 6970 to say, look, here's who we are. We need to work hard to make sure that the world is left in a state that's fit for you people of 6970. And it was really this hands across the sea. But this sea is the passage of 5 millennia. But it's there. It's underground in Osaka, and it's been there since 1971. And by retelling this story, like we're doing today, we're getting that folk memory, which is what all of these are about. This is about telling stories that pass down generations.
Well, please, by all means, keep the Rooney family going, and maybe one of your great grandsons or daughters can be there when that clock gets dug up. As for that trip around the corner to Chase Manhattan, we will do that when you are in New York together with you, and we'll also go to Times Square. Hey, look, David, the book is fascinating. We could talk about it for hours and hours by anyone's definition. It's called A History of Civilization in 12 Clocks, About Time by David Rooney, and he has been our timely guest here on the Accutron Show. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Accutron Show. To listen to all of our shows, visit accutronwatch.com. To learn more about the world of Accutron, follow us on Instagram at AccutronWatch and subscribe to our podcast. From New York City, until next time, Accutron Time.